It was only 5 days after her 50th birthday when the news broke. Stella Tennant had passed away. No cause of death, no explanation, just silence. To most of the world, she was the face of a generation. Chanel's androgynous muse with cheekbones carved from aristocracy and a gaze cold enough to freeze a camera lens. She was the modern Duchess of fashion, descended from British nobility, yet rooted in rebellion. But then, she vanished. No scandal, no downfall, just a quiet retreat from the runway, as if the world no longer saw her. Or perhaps, she no longer wished to be seen. When she returned years later, her walk was still sharp, her presence still untouchable, but something was missing. Behind the icy facade, something fragile had begun to crack. Why did she leave fashion at its peak? Why did no one notice her unraveling until it was too late? And what truly happened to the muse who disappeared after one fragrance? Long before she graced the pages of Vogue, Stella Tennant was never meant to walk a runway. Born on December 17, 1970, in the Scottish borders, Stella was the daughter of Lady Emma Cavendish and the granddaughter of Andrew Cavendish, the 11th Duke of Devonshire. Her lineage was pure aristocracy, castles, countryside, and centuries-old tradition. She grew up surrounded by privilege, but not vanity. There were no dreams of becoming a model, no childhood fascination with glamour. Instead, there were horses, muddy boots, and an artistic curiosity that led her to study sculpture at the Winchester School of Art. She was introspective, intellectual, and profoundly uncomfortable with attention. At the time, fashion was infatuated with the ultra-glamorous, the hyper-feminine, the golden girls. Stella was none of that. Her features were sharp, unapologetic, her energy more David Bowie than Claudia Schiffer. And that's exactly what made her irresistible to a new wave of editors and photographers looking to break the mold. At 22, a friend sent her portfolio, shot mostly with friends, DIY style, to British Vogue. Unexpectedly, it caught the eye of fashion photographer Stephen Maisel. One call later, she was flown to New York and dropped into the world of high fashion with no training, no ambition for fame, and no idea that she was about to become the most unconventional face of the decade. She didn't chase the spotlight. It came crashing into her life, uninvited and unstoppable. When Stella Tennant appeared in Stephen Meisel's editorial for Vogue in the early 1990s, the fashion world stopped and stared. Here was a girl who didn't look like a girl at all. With her severe bob, razor blade cheekbones, and eyes that refused to flirt, she didn't resemble the era's bombshells. She wasn't Kate, she wasn't Cindy, she wasn't trying to seduce the camera. She confronted it. And that made her revolutionary. Fashion had spent years worshiping curves and softness, but Stella arrived like a glitch in the matrix, cold, angular, and impossibly compelling. She became the poster girl for a new wave of androgyny, where beauty was no longer about pleasing the male gaze, but challenging it. Her look was sharp, intellectual, aristocratic, more statue than siren. It didn't take long for the industry to fall under her spell. Within a year, she was walking for Jean-Paul Gaultier, Versace, and Alexander McQueen. Her walk was different, purposeful, almost detached, like she wasn't performing, but existing in a space entirely her own. On the runway, she wasn't modeling clothes, she was making statements. But the real turning point came when Karl Lagerfeld made his move. In 1996, Stella became the face of Chanel. Lagerfeld, captivated by her noble lineage and icy detachment, declared her the embodiment of modern aristocracy. To him, she was the ideal Chanel woman, unreachable, unknowable, unbothered. She starred in Chanel's most iconic fragrance campaign, Allure, wearing nothing but pearls and confidence. It was more than a campaign. It was a coronation. From there, Stella's face became inescapable. She graced the covers of Vogue, ID, Harper's Bazaar, and Numero. Designers adored her, editors worshipped her, photographers trusted her to elevate every frame. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. Stella Tennant reigned in silence. And yet, she never truly belonged to the world she ruled. Unlike her contemporaries, she never courted fame. Off camera, she remained deeply private, often returning to the Scottish countryside where she lived with her husband, photographer David Lesnett, and their growing family. She gave interviews reluctantly, attended few parties, and avoided the spotlight when she could. But that only deepened the mystery. She was everywhere and nowhere, powerful yet distant, a supermodel who seemed to exist just slightly out of reach. By the late 1990s, Stella had already become more than a model. She was a symbol. For young women who didn't see themselves in the hyper-feminine ideals of beauty, Stella was a revelation. She gave androgyny a crown and made alienation look regal. And then, as quietly as she arrived, she walked away. No announcement, no scandal, just a slow fade into domestic life and art, leaving fashion behind like a lover she never fully trusted. She had conquered the industry without ever truly surrendering to it. She left before anyone could ask why. In the early 2000s, Stella Tennant retreated from the catwalks just as gracefully and mysteriously as she had entered them. There was no tabloid scandal, no rehab rumors, no paparazzi meltdown. Just a woman, slipping quietly out of the world that had once begged for her presence. To the public, it seemed like a natural evolution, a supermodel choosing family over fame. She moved back to the Scottish countryside, had 4 children, designed her own home, and appeared content living a life far removed from the fashion capitals that once adored her. But for those who looked closely, there were subtle shifts. A sense of distance that grew wider, colder, deeper. Stella gave occasional interviews, mostly about sustainability, about raising sheep, about the quiet joys of domestic life. But her words always floated just above the surface, controlled, polite, guarded. When she reemerged in the 2010s for a string of runway appearances, the fashion world applauded her return. She walked for Valentino, Alexander McQueen, and even Chanel again, this time with streaks of gray in her hair and an even sharper stillness in her eyes. She was hailed as timeless, ageless, elegant. But something had changed. There was a heaviness in her silence. In a 2018 interview, she confessed almost offhandedly, "I'm not sure fashion needs people like me anymore." It was a quiet sentence, easily missed, but beneath it echoed something deeper, an alienation not just from the industry, but from herself. She never spoke of pain directly, but her final years were lined with whispers. Friends later admitted they'd noticed changes, withdrawal, fatigue, a growing fragility behind the strength. Her social media, sparse and subdued, offered little more than glimpses, a misty landscape, an abstract drawing, a close-up of weathered stone, artful, distant, muted. There were no cries for help, just signals hidden in plain sight. And then came December 2020. Just 5 days after her 50th birthday, Stella Tennant was gone. The world was stunned. News headlines were cautious, reverent. Model Stella Tennant dies suddenly. No details, no speculation, only silence. Again. It wasn't until weeks later that her family released a statement. Stella had been unwell for some time. She felt unable to go on after a long period of mental illness. It was a sentence that felt like a whispered scream. The fashion world, always hungry for headlines, responded with uncharacteristic quiet. There were tributes, yes, Memories from fellow models, muted black and white montages, but no deep reckoning. No headlines about the pressures, the expectations, the erasure of individuality that the industry so often demands. And perhaps that was fitting, because Stella Tennant had never been one for noise. Her collapse wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It was private, lonely, and entirely invisible. Just like so many others who hide their suffering behind grace, perfection, and control. She had walked the world's grandest runways, fronted the most exclusive campaigns, redefined beauty for generations. And yet her deepest battles took place far from the cameras, far from the applause, far from the reach of anyone who could help. There is no single villain in this story, no designer to blame, no tabloid to accuse. But there is a pattern, a silence, a failure to ask the right questions, to notice when someone who seems unshakable begins to shake. Stella once said in an interview, "There's an image of me, but that's not really me." Perhaps that was her final message, that the girl in the Chanel pearls was only ever part of the truth. The rest was a woman who loved deeply, hurt quietly, and in the end, couldn't carry the weight of what the world refused to see. There was no grand comeback, no defiant return to reclaim headlines. Stella Tennant didn't need redemption in the traditional sense because she never fell in the way tabloids love to frame a fall. Her departure wasn't a collapse. It was a quiet decision, one rooted in self-preservation and a desire to protect the parts of herself that fame could not touch. After stepping back from modeling, Stella devoted herself to her family and her land. She built a life that was slower, softer, and, at least from the outside, simpler. She raised 4 children with her husband, David Lasnett, in the rolling countryside of Berwickshire. There were sheep to tend, meals to cook, and art to make. Her hands, once adorned with couture, now held gardening tools and paintbrushes. She also began to speak out, though carefully, about sustainability in fashion. Stella, who once embodied the icy precision of high fashion, became a quiet advocate for environmental responsibility. She collaborated on collections made from recycled materials. She reused outfits. She resisted the wasteful churn of trend cycles. It was her way of re-entering the industry without feeding the machine that had once consumed her. But even in this quieter chapter, the tension lingered. Her return to modeling in her 40s was met with applause, but also with the same pressure to remain ageless, flawless, untouchable. Stella obliged, but only in part. She let the gray grow in her hair. She wore her age like an accessory, not an apology. Still, the industry she helped shape didn't know how to fully embrace someone who wouldn't perform for it anymore. Stella wasn't selling youth, seduction, or fantasy. She was selling reality. And for fashion, that was harder to digest. In her final interviews, she seemed to be searching for purpose, for balance, for peace. She spoke of her love for art, for home, for the small rhythms of life away from the noise. She didn't need validation. She needed stillness. That stillness, in the end, may have been both sanctuary and struggle. But what she gave, especially in her final years, was not a grand statement, but a quiet defiance. A reminder that choosing to step away is not weakness. That aging in an industry obsessed with youth is an act of rebellion. That telling the truth, even when whispered, matters. Stella Tennant didn't stage a redemption arc. She simply lived one, on her terms. Stella Tennant never shouted. She didn't chase fame, or controversy, or attention. But in her silence, she made one of the loudest statements fashion had ever heard. She cracked the mold of the 1990s supermodel, walking in with no plan, no polish, no desire to conform. Her beauty was not engineered to please. It was raw, challenging, and unapologetically different. At a time when fashion obsessed over hyper-femininity, she carved a space for androgyny, for elegance without softness, for strength without spectacle. In doing so, she changed what it meant to be a muse. Models like Frasier Baha, Saskia DeBrow, and Kristen McManamy would follow in her wake, embodying the defiant edge she helped pioneer. Designers began to understand that beauty could be severe, that mystery could be magnetic, that detachment could be powerful. But Stella's true legacy isn't just in photographs or runway reels. It's in the questions she left behind. What happens when the world only sees your surface? What do we miss when we worship images instead of individuals? And how many more Stellas are we still failing to see? In her life, she refused to become a spectacle. In her death, she became a symbol of grace, of fragility, of the quiet weight that so many carry behind perfect exteriors. She walked through fashion like a ghost in pearls, elegant, elusive, unforgettable. And though the world tried to define her in glossy spreads and perfect poses, Stella Tennant left behind something no camera could ever capture: the haunting beauty of a woman who refused to be fully known.